The output section of our render properties defines where on our hard drive will Blender save the render result. And this is really only applicable to animations. So up at the top we have the output directory, which by default is set to your system's temp folder, but we can set this to whatever we want. I will simply add a new folder to my own temporary directory, and let's call this render output. Very clever label, I know. Let's select that folder and click accept. So now we've told Blender where to save our rendered image files. And directly below this, we have a couple toggles like overwrite, which means that if a file of the exact same file name exists, Blender will simply overwrite it. We have the ability to include or not include file extensions. We have a placeholder setting, which creates a temporary file on your hard drive in place of the rendered image file, which is particularly useful when using a render farm. So perhaps this is more for advanced users. And then finally to the right, we have cache result, which I've never actually used. And the description says that the cache data from rendering can be saved to EXR files. So I gather this is another advanced setting. We'll move on to more immediately relevant settings like the type of image output. So we have a decent list of image file formats, including movie file formats. However, I don't really recommend movie outputs for renders, because let's say we're rendering a 1,000 frame sequence and your render fails on frame 999, then the rendering of all the previous frames is a complete waste. So when rendering with animation, it's smarter to use an image sequence. And so that's up to your preference. The OpenEXR multi-layer format is going to be the most robust because it stores all of your render layer information as well as your passes, which we will get to later. But for simple renders, I usually stick with PNG or JPEG. But the default is PNG, and we have associated settings with the specific file formats. So we can set it to render black and white, RGB, or RGB with an alpha, and then the color depth 8-bit or 16-bit, and then finally the compression, which helps to optimize the size of your file. And earlier I did mention that this is really only applicable to animation. To demonstrate what I mean, clearly you can see that I have established a render output directory as well as file format settings. Yet when I kick off a rendered image, not rendered animation, once the frame finishes, I'll jump over to the directory, which is that render output right here, and there's no image saved there. However, if I go back to Blender and choose render animation, remember our dimensions, it's set from frame 1 to 142 right now, so I'll just let it render a couple frames and then hit escape. So we've got 2 frames there. And if we jump back over to my Finder window, those 2 frames have been saved to the directory. And so for saving rendered stills, here in the UV image editor, you can come down to the image menu and choose Save as Image. And in the bottom left, we have the same file format options as the output section of the render properties. And so that is how we can establish where to save our rendered images.